Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's stakeholder call to discuss the WEIM Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Enhancements Phase 2 Draft Final Proposal. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our presenter, Danny Johnson, from the ISO's Market and Infrastructure Policy team. Before we get started, these materials are available out on the WEIM RSE Phase 2 webpage. So you can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. You'll want to go to the Stay Informed tab, click Policy Initiatives, and then on that main landing page, scroll down to the bottom and find the WEIM RSE page. And then those materials will be on that main page. So before I hand it over to Danny, I have a couple reminders I just wanted to go through really quickly. The call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These calls are structured to stimulate an open dialogue and engage different perspectives with the understanding that stakeholders have read the proposal. In the interest of time today, please just refrain from repeating or reiterating what has already said. And then if you need technical assistance anytime during the meeting today, you can send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Michelle. And then we will be taking questions throughout the call today. If you connected to audio through your computer or use the Call Me option on WebEx, you can raise your hand just through the raise hand icon on the upper right-hand side of the chat window. If you connected to audio only, you'll want to press #2 to enter the question queue. And just a reminder to everyone to please state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question. And then at any time, you can also put your comment or question into the chat and address it to either all panelists or myself. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia. So the agenda today, I'm just going to give a brief overview of where we're at in the stakeholder process here in a second, and then I'll hand it over to Danny to run through the evolution of the WEIM Resource Sufficiency Evaluation and then dive into the content of the proposal. And then we'll wrap up today's call with the EIM classification and next steps for this initiative. So here we are in the stakeholder process. We're right here in proposal development, right in the middle at the draft final proposal. We did just post draft tariff language this morning, so that is available out on the initiative webpage as well for you to take a look at. And then here on the implementation side, we are targeting a June 1, 2023 go live date. So with that, I will hand it over to Danny, and he'll kick us off with the evolution of the WEIM RSE.
Thanks, Isabella. So before we jump into the proposal, I wanted to just revisit the policy development and implementation we've had over the past year, as well as some of the knock-on effects of that first phase, which really inform the proposal that you'll see before you today, and ultimately our goal of having this implemented prior to summer of 2023. Can we go to the next slide? So in 2021, we kicked off a sizable proposal to enhance the accuracy of the resource sufficiency evaluation. This ultimately was approved through joint governance in February of this year and was implemented this June. Phase 1 had enhancements for how supply was counted. It adjusted and trued up the reference point for the FlexRamp sufficiency test. It provided an expanded framework for demand response participation. It removed uncertainty adders that weren't determined necessarily to add accuracy to the test. It revised the balancing test revenue allocation to be more accurate, and it also, we think, increased transparency around the WEIM RSE through shifting the reporting duties to the Department of Market Monitoring. There were additional accuracy enhancements that were considered as part of the Phase 1 proposal. We thought that those needed additional time to have data to back up the eventual policy development, so we did choose to defer those enhancements or consideration of those enhancements. Those actually form a sizable portion of the proposal you'll see before you today. Can we go to the next slide? The other sizable portion of this proposal was a desire to have something in place prior to summer of 2023 2023 that would allow the WEIM to be leveraged to increase reliability. This came out of the February governance meeting where we had multiple governance members kind of commenting and asking if we could investigate if the WEIM could be used to increase reliability in stress system conditions. So the original accuracy enhancements and this idea of trying to increase reliability through the WEIM led to the kickoff of phase 2 of the RSEE on an accelerated timeline, which was, I think, before when we were planning on taking this up according to our roadmap, all with the goal of having something in place prior to June 1 of 2023. So I would ask, as you consider this proposal and formulate your comments, you do keep in mind what is implementable by June 1 of 2023. That's something that we really kept in mind when we were developing the policy and trying to figure out how this would work. I think there are definitely future enhancements that would be available based on the framework we've laid out. But again, if we want something to be in place prior to next summer, we're going to have to accept what we're going to have to figure out if what the CAISO is able to implement is acceptable to the stakeholder community at large. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is what makes up the RSEE Phase 2 proposal. I'd really break it down into 4 different elements. The first 3 all get back to accuracy enhancements for the WEIM RSE. This includes consideration of load conformance. It includes a more holistic review of what is the correct metrics and types of uncertainty to be tested for in the RSE. It does look into investigating how RSE obligations are informed by WEIM transfers, exports, imports, lower priority exports. In this section of the proposal, we're actually looking to clarify some tagging rules regarding our low priority exports. I have a second sub-bullet here that I want to note. We realized we left it out of the draft final proposal, but I think would look to add text in the final proposal. But one of the other things we would plan to do is to true up the intertie capacity that is considered for the CAISO in the first advisory RSE. The CAISO, as many of you may be aware, uses market schedules as the input to its RSE rather than base schedules. The first RSE is run prior to the Haas market, so we don't have the Haas market results for interchange to feed into the RSE calculation. Instead, it uses all available intertie bids. Right now, these are not constrained by the ITC capacity on the interties, so it can lead to the CAISO's results being artificially high. Ultimately, this doesn't impact how the CAISO is able to pass this test, since the binding test has the correct interchange. But for transparency purposes, we do want to make clear that this is something that we will also look to address. The second big track of this proposal is trying to leverage the WEIM to increase reliability. And this is through the development of an assistance energy product or assistance energy transfers that can occur in the WEIM following the failure of an RSE should a BAA elect to try to utilize the WEIM to increase their reliability. You want to go to the next slide, Isabella? So jumping right into this, the first topic is load conformance. The CAISO is not proposing to include load conformance in the WEIM RSE test obligations for any balancing authority, including the CAISO BAA. This was a topic of a lot of the analysis that was conducted by Guillermo's team from March to June of this year. The takeaways from that analysis were that there's really no one-to-one relationship between load conformance and increased WEIM transfers. Rather, that is one of a number of different market outcomes that can occur. Those other outcomes would be a change in operating point or commitment of additional resources internal to the CAISO, changes to hourly import schedules, both in the import direction by clearing more imports or the export direction by clearing less exports. It can actually also result in power balance constraint relaxations if conformance is too high. Given that there's no accurate way to try to regularly estimate the impact of load conformance regarding WEIM transfers, which is the only potential way, or is the only potential outcome that may inadvertently lead to passing the RSE. We don't think this is appropriate. The other thing that came out of this analysis is that during stress system conditions, actually the most typical outcome was an increase to the dispatch operating target for resources internal to the CAISO BAA. So if you think about the flex ramp test, which is testing for upward flexibility, what we actually found is you do gain some upward flexibility by WEIM transfers potentially unloading resources internal to the CAISO, but when you use this load conformance, you actually eat and use the upward flexibility of resources internal to the CAISO such that the net flexibility position of the CAISO BAA is actually degraded, and it's more difficult for the CAISO BAA to pass the WEIM RSE's flex ramp up test. We put forward our proposal to not include load conformance in the first iteration of this process. The comments we received do indicate broad support, we thought, for not including load conformance for the reasons that I've just laid out. There were advocates to further revise the RSE to maybe try to capture some of the drivers of what load conformance is needed for. I don't think that this is something that the CAISO is opposed to. We want the RSE to be as accurate as possible, but we didn't see in comments explicit drivers or explicit proposals of what could get added. That combined with our resource and timing constraints on trying to have something in place by summer 2023 means that to the extent that there is still broad stakeholder desire for further accuracy enhancements along this line of thinking, we would look to do that at a future time. So I'd like to pause and see if there are any questions.
All right, it looks like there are currently no questions in queue.
Okay. Just a kind of a public service announcement. I'm happy to take questions. If something comes to you on this type of slide or on the topic of load conformance later in the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand. We want to make sure that we are being as transparent as possible in explaining our rationale, and we think that can go a long way towards making parties comfortable with our proposal. Can we go to the next slide? So the next couple slides touch on the topic of uncertainty. We're not proposing any changes to how net load uncertainty is tested for in the WEIM RSE as part of this proposal. Right now, net load uncertainty is an existing part of the flexible ramping sufficiency test. It is currently calculated using a histogram methodology. We envision and plan for this to be replaced by the quantile regression methodology that would be concurrent with the implementation of the FRP refinements policy. We have heard some stakeholder feedback that stakeholders want to get comfortable and understand how this calculation would work. I think to the extent that you're interested, please reach out to the CAISO. We would be happy to help you understand this. As part of the FRP refinements implementation, we would look to do testing and provide market sim and all of the normal and robust testing that the CAISO does when it implements large new pieces of functionality. So we think that does provide an opportunity for parties to become comfortable with how this calculation may work. We do think the quantile regression is an improvement. The analysis that was conducted by the CAISO this spring does show that it is a more accurate estimator of uncertainty than the histogram. That isn't necessarily to say that it will decrease the requirements or increase the requirements. It will do both depending upon the circumstances, and that's okay. That's actually a good thing because we think that's more accurate. When you start to include forecast data in addition to just the historical observations, you do get different results. If the results are higher and the requirements are higher to pass the WEIM RSE, using this calculation, we would have confidence that that is a more accurate measure and estimate of potential uncertainty. The last bullet I had, we are proposing to defer to implement the net load uncertainty and the capacity test at this time. There didn't seem to be really strong stakeholder support for implementing this concurrent with FRP. There is, again, a segment of the stakeholder community that does advocate that the capacity uncertainty adder should be in place in the WEIM RSC if the RSC doesn't consider load conformance. I think on the former point of this being part of the WEIM RSC, I'm not opposed to. I think there is solid rationale for it being part of the WEIM RSC if stakeholders support that. I don't think that it serves as a great proxy for not considering load conformance. I think adding net load uncertainty to the capacity test should stand alone as a valued accuracy addition to the WEIM RSC. Can we go to the next slide? So before I take questions, I'll finish out this uncertainty section. The other thing the analysis found was that there's no great way to measure and try to estimate intertie uncertainty. If you recall, this adder was trying to capture the potential uncertainty from what is tested for at T40 and what is eventually tagged at T20. It is estimated to fairly high confidence levels as part of the proposal, but since it's a historic look back, the rub is that you want to have a data set going forward that looks somewhat similar, or your historic look back has to be somewhat similar to the conditions you're trying to estimate going forward, which naturally means that you have a smaller look back data set. You combine that with really high levels that you're trying to peg this uncertainty at, it means that there's a lot of variability in this calculation, and it tends to either grossly overstate the expected uncertainty or grossly understate it. Neither of those outcomes really seem like they're going to add accuracy to the RSE, so we're proposing to continue to not have this be part of the test. We also put this out in the first iteration of this proposal, and we thought we saw agreement in the comments that this doesn't necessarily add accuracy, and we didn't see strong support for adding it back in. The other thing that we did ask was if really any of the uncertainties should have maybe a different confidence level that they're trying to be predicted at. We got fairly limited comment on that concept. I think going forward, as we are likely to be enhancing the RSC continually to make sure it's as accurate as possible, I think that's something that we can look at, but again, I don't think that's something that we would be proposing to look at as part of this proposal. Now, I do see two questions. I want to give stakeholders an opportunity to participate, so can we open the phone lines?
Absolutely. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hey, Danny, this is Libby Kirby from Bonneville.
Hi, Libby.
Hey, a couple quick questions. So I just want to clarify, I'm pretty sure I understand this, but so the net load uncertainty is still in the flex test. It's not in the capacity test, and the capacity test will also not have the intertie uncertainty. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. There was some section in the proposal that said something about not reintroducing the net load uncertainty to the RSE obligation, and we read that as like not in the flex test, and we were like, oh my gosh, that's a huge change. But I'm assuming that was referencing the capacity test, and it just forgot to mention the capacity test piece of it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's easy. My other question is, the timeline that you guys showed a couple slides ago shows implementation in June, but is my understanding was that the quantile regression methodology is going to be implemented earlier than that, or is the expectation now that that won't be implemented until June?
Oh, thanks for providing the opportunity for that clarification. So the FRP refinements is planned for fall release 2022. So the new quantile regression would be in place by fall.
Right. Okay. The FRP refinement, that whole thing is in the fall, and the quantile regression is a sub-piece of that. Okay. It's the rest of this stuff that's not related to FRP refinement.
Exactly.
Okay. That is helpful. Thank you.
And it is a little bit of a nuance because it's almost, we're proposing not to change something, but then something's changing anyway since one of the inputs to the test changes as part of the quantile regression. So I can see how it's a little bit of a bowl of spaghetti mentally on the timelines.
Yeah, no worries. But yes, I think we internally someone had pointed that out to me already, and I kind of forgot about it. So yes, that is good clarification. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Libby.
Paul, you may go ahead. Your line's unmuted.
Hi, Danny. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to give a few thoughts on the first three topics, load conformance and the two different variations of uncertainty. Maybe starting with the last one with the intertie uncertainty. I think on that one, we're comfortable with the proposal not to reintroduce intertie uncertainty into the test. I think the changes that were made for the CAISO in particular to only include supply that had an ETAG by T minus 40 was a needed improvement, and that plays a role in kind of our view of whether or not intertie uncertainty on top of that would be necessary. And I think the other thing that I would agree with you with on that is that it doesn't seem clear that uncertainty calculation was particularly accurate. So, I think it makes sense to just set that aside and not reintroduce it into the test. On the first two, I do think there is a connection between the load conformance and the net load uncertainty, and thinking through how those things could be considered in the test. I think we've talked about load conformance a lot in the past. I recognize your point that it's not a one-for-one impact. Load conformance does not drive additional imports on a one-for-one basis. I think we recognize that. But at the same time, I think we also understand that the operators are using the load conformance as a tool, and they're trying to reposition resources. They're trying to clear more imports. To some degree, those come from the EIM. But our understanding is that one of the reasons they're doing that is they're trying to manage uncertainty, among other things. And so I think if the direction is to not include load conformance in the test, then I think that requires ensuring that there is at least some reasonable measure of uncertainty in the test. So when we're sort of talking about what could be added to the test to try to reflect more accurately what the system conditions really are in real time, I think that having an accurate measure of uncertainty in the capacity test is really critical to that. I think having no reflection of that uncertainty at all is just not appropriate. So we of course want it to be accurate. We're not opposed to using the quantile regression. I think we get the concern that broadly it's sort of untested and people aren't sure about that. So we would be supportive of something else if it was more simple, that stakeholders and different entities in the EIM felt was reasonable in terms of an uncertainty factor to be including. But I do think that in our view, it's important that we have some measure of uncertainty both in the capacity test and in the flex test.
Danny, we can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Jeff, for your comment. I think that's something we'll give some thought to. If we're not able to address it in this iteration, given the timeline we're under, I think that this would be a right topic for further discussion for future RC enhancements, which I suspect we would be undertaking.
One thing I'll just add, Danny, is my understanding, at least from some of the conversations we've had, was that a lot of the concern on the accuracy of the net load uncertainty stems from certain situations where the requirement just wasn't consistent with what the various EIM entities we're looking at in terms of their system. And I think the best example that we've mentioned in the past is having an upward capacity requirement for, say, a wind resource, even when there's no wind in the forecast. And so that's why I was sort of saying, I think, at least from my understanding, there was concern that there were some pretty just counterintuitive requirements that didn't match what those entities were thinking they should be having to hold in those types of situations. And that's what just leads me to think that, if the quantile regression is problematic or is at least something that people are worried about because of its complexity, I do think there could be solutions that are more straightforward, but have the ability to say, okay, well, maybe we're just using more of a kind of basic calculation. It's a percentage of your load or a percentage of your VAR, but we also recognize that we're not going to require uncertainty to be held when there's no VAR in the forecast. You don't have wind in the forecast. You don't need uncertainty to cover that, obviously. So, I think there could be other solutions on this, but I just wanted to mention that because this is kind of my understanding.
No, I think that's helpful, and I agree. I think our leaning would be we want to see if entities get comfortable and understand and think the quantile regression is working well, at which point we could see if that would be appropriate to put in the capacity test. I think what you're proposing is a more simplified solution, which also is valid. But I hear that and I see almost another iteration of this policy proposal because we haven't put out anything as a percentage of VER or percentage of net load or anything along those lines. And I don't think we'd be opposed to that. I would prefer to see if the quantile regression works, and then if not, have future policy development.
Danny, this is Guillermo. Let me also add on that. Okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of sympathy for the concerns expressed about the uncertainty introduced by this new calculation, right? The quantile obviously is more complex. It's not as simple to understand how the math is working because it's a more sophisticated and statistical approach. And I think we end up with this more complicated approach precisely because we want it to be more accurate. I think the underlying concern originally was the poor accuracy of this histogram that we currently have. So I think we have to be cognizant that this is a trade-off between simplicity and complexity and accuracy and poor accuracy, right? And we are striving to get the right balance here. As you try to incorporate more complexity to make it more accurate, necessarily you are going to start getting this more obscure, more complex, and harder to understand. One of the points that Jeff was bringing is that obviously there are some cases that are obviously challenging to explain when you use a very simplified approach, like the histogram that is purely based on on historical information, right? If you have a changing condition through the day, it's not going to be sensible to those changes simply because it's not designed to react to those dynamic variables over the day. And that is precisely we move into the quantile regression because now, based on the conditions, based on the forecast, it's going to be adjusted accordingly. But the trade-off is the complexity. So we are quite open to explore other alternatives. I can tell you that at the end of the day, we have to put the principle here. And the principle is that we are dealing with uncertainty. By nature, it's not going to be a precise science. There is an expectation that once you are dealing with risk, uncertainty, you will not be able to get 100% accurate all the time. And that is something that is inherent to the technical issue we are dealing with. It's not an issue with the methodology per se. Any methodology is going to present pros and cons, but no one is going to give you 100% accuracy. I think we have to be intellectually honest in that sense that no matter what methodology we're going to have, there will be a trade-off between accuracy and complexity. Thank you.
Danny, do you mind if I just respond to Guillermo's comments?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I appreciate that, Guillermo, and I agree with you that I think you're right that there's a spectrum of and it's trade-offs between simplicity and accuracy, and I do think that there's an opportunity to look at that. And I think it's logical at this stage to say, okay, well, let's take a look at the quantile regression and see if it's if the EIM entities and stakeholders more generally are comfortable with it, and if so, then that's great. I think from our point of view, from a policy perspective at where we are now, I think what we would like to see is the recognition that having a measure of uncertainty in the test is what we are looking to do, and then the question is, what is the right methodology, and how do we just take the quantile regression methodology as is, or do we develop something different? But the goal and the objective is that by the time we get to June of next year, there's a reasonable measure of uncertainty in the test. I think that I just wanted to kind of reemphasize. I think that's what we would like to see the direction of the proposal lead to.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah, hey, and this is Brad Cooper from the Cal ISO. You know, and uncertainty does remain in the flex ramp test. You know, one thing we didn't get a lot of response to, and it was, you know, this was something that the NSC first pointed out in their opinion when we put net load uncertainty in the capacity test originally, before that we suspended it, was that, you know, our flexible ramping product is using that same requirement, and, you know, ideally it procures to as much up to 97.5 uncertainty, but it procures on a demand curve, and if it's too expensive, it doesn't procure up to the 97.5 level. So something we should consider in the future is, you know, should the RSC uncertainty components consider that? Is 97.5% the right level to have in the RSC test, given that, you know, we have explicit features in the market that we won't procure up to 97.5 if it's above, you know, certain costs. So that's something people should think about.
Thanks, Brad. I couldn't agree more. Can we go to Robert?
Yes, we have another caller in queue.
Hey, David, it's Rob Fisher with NDE. Can you just confirm you can hear me okay? I got a weird audio setup today.
It's getting better.
Okay, let me get a little closer.
That's much better.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So just to kind of, just one quick request. Back in the spring, we had, in regards to the quantile regression, we had asked for kind of some data in regards to what it would look like, and I don't know if it was published or not, and maybe I may have missed it, but I think that would be a very helpful aspect in that kind of seeing our planning and see what it's going to look like when it's finally deployed.
So I think you cut out there a little bit at the end, but rephrasing so to make sure I understood, and I think Guillermo may be able to weigh in. You requested specific data on the performance of the quantile regression, and I do know Guillermo's team on a BA basis, or?
Yeah. Because the presentation in the spring, and I don't recall the exact meeting it was, but I had asked specifically if we could get the BA level information, because obviously with the uncertainty levels in the shoulder seasons, that's one of what we wanted to kind of do some examinations to see how the quantile regression performed in regards to shoulder seasons versus the current methodology. And so I think if we could get some kind of data ahead of time, that would be very helpful in seeing how that's going to work and what our expectations may be going forward after that.
Sure.
Okay, well, I would defer to Guillermo.
Yeah.
Sorry, Guillermo.
Let me understand better, Robert, because I think we discussed this in the previous round. So what we have done is that originally we put an appendix with a description of what the methodology was. Mm-hmm. And then more recently, as part of this effort of the springtime where we dedicated the analytics to support the RSC, we did a more comprehensive analysis, and we assessed by a specific BA how they would perform. We did this type of counterfactual analysis, right? With the current logic and with the quantized, how different the outcome would be. So that analysis is specific by BA, and I believe we provide the breakdown by, at least by season or by month. So, but what I'm hearing is that it's not just that. What you're asking is actually the underlying data. Is that the request?
My recollection is we didn't get the monthly data. And I mean, if we had the monthly data, and I can reference back to see if there was the monthly data. I just recall it was a seasonal aspect that, or quarterly aspect that we couldn't really see the monthly data. And if it is by month, then my apologies, and I can go back and reference that data. It's just that data is very important for us to analyze and compare with the current methodology and see how those changes will occur.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have the granularity, but I am in the same place like you. I don't remember if it was quarterly or monthly, so we can check.
My recollection is quarterly, and because I asked specifically for the monthly data because I wanted to see, do an apples to apples comparison to what we're doing now.
Okay, let me check. And if the data is not on a monthly basis, we can make a revised version and put it more granular on a monthly basis.
Very much appreciate that. Thank you very much. And then just a second comment in regards to what Brad was saying, 100% support the idea of, having a review of that 97.5%. In our comments, we had mentioned that it would be nice to have a periodic examination of how the 97.5 is performing. I know it's a configurable value and it's in the BPM. So I think we fully support the idea of reviewing that and seeing how that numeric value could possibly change over a period of time and periodically review that number.
Thank you, Robert. Are there any more questions on these first couple topics before we move forward?
No additional questions in queue.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any in the chat either.
I think we can skip 2 slides forward then. All right, so this is the last of the accuracy enhancements we wanted to touch on today, and it deals with this phenomenon where advisory WEIM transfers can enable the additional clearing of LPT exports out of the CAISO's HAS process from the CAISO BAA. This is something that analysis to date has shown does occur and can lead to the CAISO BAA inadvertently failing the WEIM RSE. The driver of this is that the obligations from those LPT exports are added to the CAISO BAA's RSE requirement, while neither the supply bids nor the WEIM advisory transfers, which may have in fact backed those LPT exports, are able to be counted as supply for the CAISO BAA. The analysis that Guillermo's team conducted this spring showed that this does occur. It's a bit sporadic, trying to estimate the magnitude, but it can be anywhere from hundreds to potentially thousands of megawatts of additional obligation being included on the CAISO BAA. In a really narrow sense, this can create reliability issues and the need for LPT curtailments. Under the existing rules for the WEIM RSE, transfers are limited to the greater of the base transfer of the last past interval. So to the extent that these transfers would be needed and ramping up throughout the hour to back LPT exports, having transfers frozen could actually necessitate curtailment of LPT exports, which isn't something that ideally happens from a reliability perspective. So we are, can we go to the next slide? We are planning to propose to not consider LPT exports from the CAISO BAA in the CAISO BAA's WEIM RSE obligation. This would be for both the capacity test as well as the flexible ramp up test. Stakeholders have acknowledged their support for LPT exports that are cleared out of the HAS that the CAISO BAA can't necessarily support not being included. In the straw proposal, we actually tried to put out a little bit more nuanced of an approach where we would calculate the quantity that could be supported and not be supported, and then make some adjustments to the receiving end of these LPT exports for RSE purposes. That we'll talk about in the future, but didn't get a ton of support. Absent that, just based off principle, the CAISO BAA should not be failing the RSE due to obligations that are not totally firm in nature that it would curtail prior to any risk to its own load or ability to operate. So under that principle, we are proposing that to not include any LPT exports in the CAISO BAA's obligation. In practice, the CAISO BAA would curtail LPT exports, again, prior to risking its own load. We, at the same time, will look to support as many of these exports as possible. We did examine other potential solutions to try to figure out how we could unwind this problem. If you try to account for the RSE obligations in the HAS clearing process itself, that starts to get pretty technically complicated because the HAS clearing process is actually what informs the RSE obligations. So you don't know those before you go into the HAS clearing process, so you have to start making lots of estimates or running parallel market runs and trying to use that as an input. That is both very technically challenging and something that we definitely can't support implementation-wise prior to the summer of 2023. There are other options. The CAISO could, for example, zero out all of its ETSRs in the HAS and then ensure that no WEIM advisory offers would be able to back LPT exports. We think that this is also a non-starter. This would be a drastic reduction in the efficiency of the WEIM, given the CAISO BAA's transmission positioning between the Pacific Northwest and the Desert Southwest. To be frank, this is a hard problem to solve. There's not a lot of great solutions on the technical side that we think we can implement. And so just from a principle perspective, the most straightforward thing would be not to count obligations the CAISO BAA is not confident will be able to flow in real time and would curtail prior to risking its own load. So let me go through the next slide, and then I think we'll take the question in the queue. So the other half of this is the CAISO is proposing to retain the existing rules that allow LPT exports from the CAISO BAA to count as supply in the WEIM RSE for WEIM BAAs. Again, in the previous iteration, we tried to put out a more nuanced proposal where the CAISO would have a calculation and try to estimate the amount that could be supported from resources internal to its BAA against the amount that may have been supported by WEIM advisory supply offers or even intertie resources, and then to make adjustments to the RSE showings for neighboring BAAs who were the sink side of that transaction. The feedback we got in the straw proposal was that there is not support for this approach. There's a few different reasons that were put forward for not supporting it. The first is that it would be really, really challenging to do in an operational time frame. I mean, the CAISO at best would probably be getting this information out after the HAS run around where the RTBS2 run is. This leaves WEIM BAAs very little time to try to update their base schedules to true up any discounts that are applied to their LPT exports that they're showing. There's also an argument that this is just a reduction in efficiency of the WEIM. The market has determined that these transfers should be expected to flow based off an optimal dispatch that's occurring in the HAS run for the next 7 15-minute intervals, requiring BAAs to base schedule online additional resources for the purpose of passing this test could lead to a loss in efficiency and pricing issues, since it could basically create oversupply conditions of base scheduled online resources. To be totally transparent, we do recognize this is an asymmetry in how the RSE test works between the CAISO and the remainder of the WEIM BAAs. Effectively, the HAS process does lead to the potential for WEIM advisory transfers to be firmed up to be then able to be shown for WEIM BAA base schedules. This, to us, is a solution that is supported by the stakeholders, and ultimately, we aim to have a stakeholder-driven process. So I think that's why we're going forward with this proposal is recognizing it's not an ideal solution, but given the circumstances, is a solution that has the most and broadest support from the stakeholder community. So I do see we have a question from Libby.
Hey, Danny, this is Brad. Just real quick, I just want to emphasize when thinking about this issue, it's that LPT exports from the ISO can be supported by transfers, but then again, they may not be. They may come from internal resources, but like as Danny went over, you can't tell in advance. So this is one reason we're proposing what we are proposing, that the transfers can come in and support exports and make the ISO fail when it shouldn't have. The ISO kind of has nothing to do with that transaction. And then if that's entirely the way our exports were supported, then yes, we would not be proposing what we're proposing on this slide, that other VAs be able to count the exports, because you can't count transfers. But then again, the market outcome may be that the LPT exports are entirely supported by CalISO and internal resources, and it's a kind of the same outcome that would have occurred if we would have zeroed out the ETSRs to make sure everything's coming from the ISO. And in that case, it is appropriate to no one would argue that they shouldn't be able to count those exports. So that's why we've arrived at this I prefer to call it balanced approach rather than non-symmetrical. Anyway, go to the question.
Hey, Danny. Libby from Bonneville. So I have two questions I'd like to talk about. The first is, understand that the slides are discussing not including LPT exports in the CAISO RSE obligation. That sounds different than what we saw in the proposal, which we're a little concerned about. The proposal says in the upwards test, you would only account for demand, net load uncertainty, and exports that meet the high priority criteria. But on the downward test, you would include all aspects exports, and that was a little bit concerning to us. We understand the idea that if there's the export piece looks firm in the test, but the import piece is based on advisories, and those may not be there. So can understand counting them a certain way, but we assumed that you would be counting them the same way in both tests. This way feels a little bit like you're going to do the helpful thing in the up test, but then also the helpful thing in the down test, where you're saying, hey, we have lots of exports, so that's going to give us some nice potential downward flexibility, but not count the import side that would give you the up side of that. And so can you discuss why there would be a difference in the way you would treat them between the upward test and the downward test?
Yeah, sure. So our thinking is, again, in the upward test, we don't know that we can support these from resources internal to the CAISO BAA, and our position would be that the CAISO BAA should not fail because of transfers that were cleared, potentially not from supply internal to its BAA. In the downward direction, there's no risk to CAISO BAA load. The CAISO would support and would export out if it was able to and needed that downward flexibility. The downward test is seeing if there's enough downward flexibility, and to the point there's a willing export offer who's willing to take power out of the CAISO. We don't see any reason why we wouldn't engage in that from a reliability perspective or a prioritization of CAISO BAA load perspective.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is on the upward side of things, the ability to meet as in you could curtail those exports if you're not able to meet your own load, which would be an issue with AICS. But there's no reason, if your issue is with DECs, you wouldn't be ever curtailing an export. That's not what you do for DECs. Okay, I'm following.
Exactly.
Thank you. And then our other question is, in the proposal somewhere, I don't have the page in front of me, but there was a discussion, I think that, I guess I could probably control F, but it was that curtailments would happen if CAISO got to an EEA3. Generally, my understanding is EEA3 is like you're shedding firm load at that point. I would have assumed that because these are like firm provisional, I think was the proposal, that these would have been curtailed prior to an EEA3. But is the expectation that you would get into an EEA3 and then curtail LPG exports? And then
no, I think to the point that this is confusing in the proposal, that's on us. The expectation would be that the CAISO would curtail these prior to entering into an EEA3. And then after further discussion with our system ops group, our practice of arming firm load as reserves to release those reserves as energy to meet deficiencies, that likely triggers an EEA3. So we would look to actually curtail these prior to engaging in that type of action.
Okay, so prior to getting to an EEA3 and prior to using your like emergency demand response?
Or
is
no,
that something different? Sorry.
The RDRR can be utilized any time that we're in an energy emergency at the discretion of the operators. It's a little bit nuanced about how the bids are enabled in the market, and our operators are a little careful because they tend to have a single daily start and a limited runtime, so they don't want them to be dispatched and then come back during net load peak. But they have ability to utilize those at any point as long as an emergency condition, I think starting at a warning exists.
Okay, and sorry, so what is the piece that would happen between the 2 and the 3?
Yeah, so one of the things that the CAISO has done during recent stress system conditions to maintain reliability is it's actually armed firm load to release the reserves that are held to be used for energy. And so we would look to curtail these prior to that.
Okay. Okay, I think that's my 2 questions. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. We're moving to the next caller in queue. Bonnie, you're unmuted.
This is Bonnie Blair. I represent the 6 Cities group. Can you guys hear me okay? Danny?
Yes. Hi, Bonnie.
Okay. So my question has to do with reserves. Does the CAISO carry reserves for imports that count as supply for RSE purposes, or are the reserves supplied by the external entity that's sourcing the import?
So on the intertie imports, I believe the reserves are carried by the source of those intertie schedules. Brad, does that match what your recollection is?
Yeah, because the reserve implicitly, because reserve obligations are 3% of load and 3% of generation. So as you're importing, your reserve obligation goes down, and as you're exporting, your reserve obligation goes up.
Without regard to the classification of the import as either firm or contingent firm from the importing entity's perspective?
I think there is, and I don't believe we have Dave Delpart from operations where he had a conflict, and he knows the exact answer, but I think there is a classification of energy that doesn't come with the imports, I mean with the reserves, and it's my recollection though that the CalISO doesn't accept those kind of tags. So effectively, yeah.
What I'm reaching for here is whether the proposal reflects symmetry between the reserve obligations that are applicable to imports and the LPT exports that are going to be identified as conditional firm. That's where I was going with those questions.
Well, then I think
we will.
Sorry, Brad, go on.
We will have reserves to cover LPT exports, and in the vast majority of circumstances, they would prevent us from, being threatened with an EEA3 and have to curtail them. But to the extent things happen beyond what reserves handle, then these the firm provisional would come into play, and then we would curtail them.
Right. What I was trying to figure out is whether there's kind of a symmetric or consistent treatment of reserves for imports that come into the CAISO and then exports, including the LPT exports. And it sounds like there is, but I guess if you guys could confirm that, maybe in the final proposal, that would be helpful. And we can include that question in our written comments on the draft.
When you say clarify on imports, do you mean the imports coming in as transfers, or do you mean other imports, hourly imports that denertize in half?
I think what I'm reaching for is imports that might be comparable to the LPT exports in terms of quality or degree of support provided by the entity on the other end of the import.
Yeah, the imports coming, the difference in situation with other people buying imports from the ISO, which are being exported from the ISO as LPT exports, and imports the ISO is buying from other BAAs, is our exports are being cleared through the market. So, it can't be assured that they're not clearing against advisory transfers, or it can't be assured they're not being cleared against RA supply in the ISO. But then when other entities are offering imports to the ISO, they're manually determining the amount of excess energy they have, and they know the source of that energy. And I understand, or marketers may be looking for the energy, but that supply is coming ultimately from a supplier that knows it has some excess and is offering that excess, where exports from the ISO can get in this situation, like we described, where they're clearing against transfers, or they're clearing against CalISO RA capacity.
Do you think that difference is a reason to treat the reserve obligations differently, or not?
I think the reserve obligations are the same. You know, these are WEC reserve obligations. So everyone's following the same rules as far as reserve obligations.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. I mean, what I was really wanted to be sure or wanted to understand is you know whether the CAISO BAA was carrying reserve obligations both on imports and exports, which wouldn't be appropriate in my mind, or at least I'd have to be convinced that you know there was a reason why that was a reasonable outcome. But if everybody is applying the same rules with regard to reserves, then that seems fine.
Yeah, I don't think there's any inconsistencies in reserve obligations.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the explanation.
All right, we're moving to the next caller in queue. Jeff, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Danny. It's Jeff with PowerX again. I was going to give you a few thoughts on this, but I just wanted to ask a clarifying question first to make sure I understand the proposal. When you say that LPT exports would be excluded, does that include LPT exports that clear day ahead, that might clear, you know, IFM and or RUC, or is it just real time?
It would be all LPT exports under this proposal.
Okay. Well, so just a few thoughts on this at a high level. I mean, so first of all, we recognize a concern here, and I think we've talked about this in previous calls. It's definitely in need of a solution, and it doesn't seem right to have the CAISO end up put in effectively a short position, either from the perspective of the resource efficiency test or just more generally by having this interaction between advisory EIM imports and HASP exports. And so, I just want to say up front, we recognize that we need to find a solution to this. But my concern with what you're proposing is it seems to broaden the solution seems to broadly apply, just based on what I just asked, which is that it would effectively exclude all exports that aren't supported by RA resources, but that would include the bucket of exports that cleared the day-ahead market, cleared RUC, and that I think there is an expectation from the exporter that there was supply supporting that. And so it seems like that solution doesn't narrow in on this fundamental issue and is opening up a bigger pool of exports that are excluded. And so I think that's a concern at a high level. But the other element of that is the concept that you would exclude it from the CAISO's BA's test, but include it in the receiving BA's test. I don't think that works. I think that leads to double counting because in effect you have potentially a large volume, right? You potentially have several thousand megawatts of exports where in effect multiple BAs are counting the same resource because you'd have the CAISO not including that export in its test, recognizing that, hey, they could be curtailed, they're effectively non-firm exports. So they are the resources that are delivering that non-firm export is getting included as being capable of meeting CAISO load. But at the same time, you have another entity that's also including that import to meet their load. And I just think that's not correct. So I think kind of fundamentally here, we need to be transparent, but also consistent in that whatever the rules end up being, whatever that bucket is of supply that is effectively non-firm and excluded from the CAISO's test should also not be included on the other side. I just think if we go down this road, we end up overstating the overall supply, and it really causes challenges in my mind from an accuracy point of view. So I think, I also recognize some of what you said before, though, about it's kind of hard in real time through the HASP itself to figure out what's what. I think what we would contemplate as being a potentially workable solution is to say exports that clear the RUC, they are included in the CAISO's supply just like they are today. Low priority exports that don't clear the RUC, that are effectively non-firm, would be excluded. But the other piece of that is we still continue to believe those need to be tagged clearly as non-firm. And I know we haven't got to that slide yet, but firm provisional, we don't see that as being used in the industry. And when we kind of take a step back and think about what we're talking about here, we're talking about supply that could be curtailed, particularly in those really critical conditions, because there aren't resources to support them necessarily. And so I think that clearly labeling those as non-firm gives that transparency to everybody about what these are, what they represent, and gives a framework for treating them in the RS test in a way that's consistent across multiple BAs and clear to everyone. So I think that this proposal needs some work in this area, but I do recognize the challenge you're trying to solve and that we need to figure out a way to address this issue.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll table the tagging discussion because I think that's on our next slide. On your first point regarding day ahead, that's actually something that we've wrestled with. When we started thinking about this, we were thinking, yeah, the problem is basically the WEIM transfers, but when we thought about it a little bit more broadly, we do curtail day-ahead LPTs if necessary to protect CAISO load. So it seemed reasonable to us to extend it, but I can understand that it can be viewed as a bit of an extension over what the original problem we were trying to solve. It just seemed consistent to us with how these priorities would flow all the way from day-ahead through real-time.
Well, and that's, I understand that, and there's kind of a spectrum of where do you draw that line, but that's why I was trying to say that at least from our point of view, we could see the case being made that where we're going to draw that line is the RUC, because that's where you actually have run the day-ahead process that establishes which schedules have been identified as being supported and which ones haven't. But I think like I mentioned before, what needs to go along with that is then the clear delineation on the scheduling front through the E-tag of what those different schedules represent, and there needs to be consistent treatment in the RS test between the source and sink BAs. In this case, the CAISO, that's pretty much the relevant BA on the source side. Otherwise, I just think that double counting concern, you have supply going into someone's test, it's excluded in someone else's test, you no longer have an accurate representation of the overall supply in the footprint. You no longer have an accurate representation of the supply in those single BAs either, because they're both effectively assuming that they get access to the same resource. And I just think that's going to create a lot of issues going forward. So
yeah,
anyhow, thank you.
I think this is a valid point, Jeff. I'd ask that you kind of put this in your comments, and this is definitely something that we'll give more thought between now and when the next iteration of the proposal comes out regarding the RUC timeline.
Okay, thanks, Danny.
All right, moving to the next caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hey, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So I raised my hand to ask exactly the question that Jeff did about the day-ahead LPT versus the HASP LPT. And, just the events of the last 2 days just make that even more clear. And like the system operator messages going out about, if you're tagging amounts above your RUC award, operators being aware that those could be curtailed, those sorts of things, just really highlights that CAISO is saying that if an LPT award makes it through RUC, that you can expect that it's going to be there as a receiving VA in real time. And so it just, to me, didn't make a lot of sense to have this applied to those RUC LPT exports, even though I agree that the rationale for looking at the HASP LPT exports is more straightforward with the EIM advisory clearing coming in at that point. So I guess I just would appreciate more dialogue on that in the future, maybe a little bit more explanation of CAISO's rationale, and then also getting some feedback from EIM system operators outside of CAISO as well for what they may be looking at, and obviously they want to maintain their system reliability, not just to pass the RSE, but to be reliable, and so they may have some feedback, some input on how they would be looking at these exports from the CAISO imports to their BA, regardless of how they get counted in the RSC as well, and maybe that then implies how they should be counted in the RSC, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Dan. I think that you and Jeff have really raised valid points that maybe there is a nuance on the type of LPTs that get counted, and RUC, and knowing that our day-ahead reliability process did say that these should be there coming real time makes sense as that demarcation point. So that's definitely something that we'll give additional thought to.
Yeah, and I guess if you ultimately decide that you're not that they're being counted in the way it's currently proposed, that almost implies that you have to have different tagging conventions for all of your LPT exports that clear RUC, and that would have a very large ramifications for the market.
Yeah, the tagging slide's coming up next, so we can chat about our tagging proposal there.
Okay, thanks.
All right, going to the next caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hey, Danny, this is Libby again from Bonneville. I have one more question that sort of occurred to me listening to the last two folks chatting. This question is about in excluding the LPT exports. I understand that, again, the original argument, I think, was there are advisory EIM imports that are not sort of counted as firm or counted towards the CAISO's RSC test, whereas these exports are counted as firm and counted towards the RSC test. And this may be related to what these folks were talking about a minute ago, but how does that compare to, like, let's imagine there are no EIM advisory imports. Is there the potential for some maybe more clear double counting if the CAISO doesn't count the LPT export in its flex up test? Essentially, I guess what I'm asking is if that LPT export is actually based on internal CAISO capacity as opposed to an internal, or an advisory import, does that end up being a little bit more double counting-ish?
I think if we didn't have the EIM transfers, there would be a reduced chance of getting double counted, and the ISO would more comfortably be able to guarantee that these exports would be ultimately deliverable. But
I guess what I'm concerned about those
and the intertie supply are really the two risks that make these less deliverable.
I guess the concern though then is your ability to pass the RSE being based on your internal supply, like your internal capacity, without assuming these exports are going to be met, is dealt one way, and then that other BA is then assuming that supply, like essentially your RSE test. Let's say the two BAs just barely meet the RSE, the flex up test. the capacity in your BA is seemingly unloaded to meet that flex up test, whereas that capacity has then been sort of sold as energy to the BA getting the sink of the LPT export.
Yeah, if I'm following, you're saying there's a double counting that can occur because they're just not being added to the CAISO's obligation. Is that, am I following this right, Libby?
Yeah, like essentially you're potentially, again, it may not matter if you're passing the RSE by hundreds of megawatts, maybe this isn't an issue, but, or significantly more than the exports, these LPT exports that are depending on that capacity. But in a case where you're sort of both depending on it, you're ending up with, like that capacity is counting, unloaded capacity counting towards your RSE uncertainty, because there's that export that is actually depending on that capacity is no longer there in the test, whereas on that BA sink, like that is assuming, again, let's assume no import, no advisory imports, that export is assuming it's going to use some of that capacity. Again, as I'm saying it out loud, maybe it's a small concern. I don't know how often those kind of things would actually add up to make a problem, but just sort of curious if that's something y'all have considered.
I think absent the WEIM transfers, it's not a significant problem because the CAISO, in an ideal world, once FRP refinements is in place, is through the HAS procuring what it needs to meet its own demand and its own internal uncertainty, and then only the residual internal capacity would be used to clear these exports. To me, when I've thought about this, the double counting with this approach, the potential is it would occur between WEIM BAAs because one WEIM BAA would be showing supply for the purpose of passing their base test, and then another could indirectly be showing that some of that same supply that effectively gets mapped as an LPT export from the CAISO BAA.
Okay, I'm going to have to noodle on this a little bit more, but thank you.
Sure.
All right, there are no additional questions in queue.
Okay. Well, we can move to the next slide then. I do see one question before we move forward. Can we go back and take Jenny's question?
Yep, looks like Jenny just put her hand up. You may go ahead. Jenny, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead. I think, Jenny, you may be double muted. Your line is unmuted. You may go ahead. All right, I think she's having some audio problems, Danny.
Okay, well then we'll be happy to come back to her when she's able to get through. So this next slide touches on the CAISO's proposed revisions to the tagging requirements that we're pairing with the changes to how LPT exports are counted in the RSE. And the proposal is to require lower priority exports to be tagged as firm provisional. To us, this is just an extension of that market scheduling priority post-HAS that we currently have, where CAISO will prioritize CAISO BAA demand and PT exports prior to LPT exports. We did get some feedback that this doesn't make a lot of sense, and that some parties said no, they should be firm. Some said they should no, they should be non-firm. To us, that almost kind of highlighted that our proposal to designate these as firm provisional does make a lot of sense, because ultimately they are somewhere, we believe, between a firm and a non-firm schedule. A firm will be viewed equal priority to a BA's own load. Obviously, these don't meet that qualification. On the non-firm side, these wouldn't be curtailed due to economic reasons. These would only be curtailed, I think, if you look at the firm provisional definition, due to some pre-agreed upon circumstance between the two transacting parties. in that case, this pre-agreed upon circumstances, the CAISO BAA is no longer able to honor its own demand and honor its own PT exports that are cleared from its BAA. So that would be the condition which we think actually makes sense to qualify these as firm provisional. I do recognize the comment earlier regarding maybe some differentiation between what comes out of RUC and what comes out of the real-time process. I don't know if that needs to be done through tagging. The way we've thought about this is we wouldn't ever look to curtail these through the market clearing process itself. We would look for the LPT curtailments to continue to occur manually with system operator supervision. We wouldn't expect these to occur often because we would look to carry reserves for these exports. And then to the extent that curtailment did have to occur, we would actually look to prioritize manual curtailment and would offer first priority to day-ahead cleared LPT exports, a second priority to real-time cleared LPT exports that cleared as a price taker, and then would offer the lowest priority, in fact, to LPT exports that cleared due to a real-time economic export offer. So we think that can somewhat address the different priorities of LPT exports that would fall within this firm provisional tag. Again, I know the feedback we got is this isn't a commonly used designation within the Western Interconnection. That's fair, but no other balancing authority in the Western Interconnection operates a centrally cleared market that looks anything like the HASP. And so ultimately, we think that this is the appropriate tagging designation that reflects the quality of these exports. I see we have a question from Dan.
Dan, you may go ahead. Your line's unmuted.
Thanks, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions again. Without looking at the entire participant list, I guess my fear here would be that this is policy that would have large ramifications for both the day-ahead and real-time market, and would be impacting entities that are not usually in the EIM stakeholder process, specifically in the marketer community as well. Plus just thinking about more broadly, just even within some of the power supply functions within the EIM entity BAs. Markets need transparency and stability and consistency, and I guess my concern here, just as a kind of agnostic observer of what's going on, is just that this could cause a lot of disruptions in the marketplace and changing things, and we just hope that everybody that this is going to impact has a chance to be a part of considering the solution, and that maybe this too might have to lead to a more broad consideration of other alternatives within the resource sufficiency program. If ultimately these types of solutions are needed, they're solutions that could be very disruptive during the type system conditions that we're having today and for the next few days when they're enacted right at real time, but they may not be quite as impactful if it was something you were doing more in the stuck horizon. If people get some changes in their supply a few hours out in advance, that's a different thing than finding out T40 or T75 that supply could be changing significantly going right into the operating hour. So I know you're not looking for broad changes to the entire resource sufficiency program at this point, but some of these solutions seem like they almost call for thinking more holistically about the program because of their disruptive nature close to real time.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, this is Brad. We don't view this as a significant change. These LPT exports, even the day-ahead ones that clear RUC currently have this lower priority in the HASP, and arguably they currently have this lower priority intra-hour, we view this as clarifications of that priority, and then this tagging provision is firm provisional as an implementation detail of that priority to make that priority transparent to other market participants. And we've had issues implementing those current priorities when, like, that day ahead LPT exports have they've been being tagged as firm, and so we've had, even in the HASC, we've had problems implementing that priority because it hasn't been transparent to other BAAs. But these were put into our tariff as part of the summer 2021 enhancements. So we don't view this as a huge change to the priority of these LPT exports.
Just adding on to what Brad said, we actually think that this, Dan, to your point, enhances the transparency and what the quality of these exports are in real-time operations. If everything is tagged as firm that comes out of the CAISO, whether it's a BAA that is forward contracted with a resource in the CAISO and is exporting that out under a PT export, or somebody who's just making a self-scheduled supply offer into the HASP in a tight condition trying to clear exports, we do think that there should be a differentiation on the quality of those exports, because in practice we do differentiate and will curtail the LPT exports prior to CAISO BA demand or firm exports. And absent this, like Brad said, it makes it almost more murky in real-time operations and tight system conditions, because then BAAs don't know what the firmness of their otherwise designated firm exports would be.
I mean, I'm just providing feedback here, and I'll leave it to other entities who may be affected to carry their water and that sort of thing, and on providing additional feedback. But I think that there are market expectations when schedules are clearing RUC, that those are effectively firm. So changing those expectations or changing how they're represented on tags may then change how the receiving BAs feel about their ability to rely on them for their own reliability, and that may have ramifications for how those get treated and priced in the market.
Yeah, external entities should not have, we changed those rules. Before the summer 2021 enhancements, export schedules, LPT exports that cleared RUC had, I believe it was, higher priority than load, and so people had, maybe I got that wrong, maybe it's even to load, but they had a high priority that anything that cleared RUC day ahead had a high priority in real time. We changed that even LPTs that clear RUC have a lower priority than ISO load, and so there shouldn't be a big expectation. Now, if the RUC load forecast is right, they're going to be delivered, but there's the possibility that real-time conditions are higher loads than were accounted for in RUC, and those today those LPT exports with RUC schedules are going to be curtailed in the HASC.
Yeah, I'm well aware of all those changes. I just think that there's still a market expectation that getting through or being cleared through RUC and not having been curtailed from your IFM schedules is a more reliable product than firm provisional. But I'll leave it there. I think I've hopefully communicated my point, and just hope that this is a change that more than 50 stakeholders are aware of who are on the call.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, we have another caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Oh, thanks. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX again. I thought that was a very interesting discussion, and I agree with Dan's general, just the general issue he's raising in terms of saying like this is an important topic. I'm not sure that I quite see it the same way that he does on the concerns around this being disruptive per se. I think I actually agree more kind of, Danny, with what you were saying, that this is, I think, a step towards improved transparency relative to today. Because one of the things that's important to recognize is these types of transactions aren't just between balancing authority areas. It's not necessarily just between, CAISO and an EIM entity. There are other third parties and marketers that are in the market. And so what can happen is, in today's world, what we tend to see is in these tight conditions, the exports coming out of the CAISO are all being tagged effectively as firm. The buyer may not be the entity that's actually got any, they're not necessarily the scheduling coordinator. They're not necessarily the ones arranging the export from the CAISO. They may have purchased energy from another entity, and maybe that entity also purchased it from someone upstream of them. You could have a transaction in the bilateral market that changes hands multiple times, and ultimately the purchaser that's receiving that energy does not have the ability to go and validate, well, did my schedule clear RUC or not? And so all they're seeing is that they have a firm E-tag coming into their BA. And so, a CAISO market notice that says, check your RUC schedules isn't meeting that transparency objective for those entities because they're not the ones that are interacting with the CAISO. And so, I think what that leads to is just a lot of lack of clarity about what these transactions represent. And I think that can be pretty inefficient because it can lead entities to just be reluctant to want to transact. They might just say, well, I don't want an energy source out of the CAISO because I don't really know what I'm getting. And then I'm not sure, is it firm, is it not, is it cleared in the RUC or is it not? And so, I think we're open to ideas in terms of details, including, what is the appropriate demarcation point for some of these things between saying, okay, we're assuming these exports are firm or sufficiently firm that they should be included in the EIM RS test and treated that way and tagged that way, as opposed to schedules that are excluded from the resource sufficiency test and tagged as non-firm and clearly identified as such. But I think the principle that we would want to start with is that demarcation needs to include that transparency so that there's a common understanding about what those two different kind of categories are. But that being said, I think it's right that more dialogue's necessary here to work out exactly what the appropriate approach should be. But I just wanted to add some feedback to the higher level discussion about this topic.
Thanks, Jeff. We are trying to add that transparency, and we think our proposal does do that. I guess to the overarching concern that Dan raised about this having potentially broad impact, that's true. At the same time, we're running an open stakeholder process and are noticing all of our meetings. So from the CAISO side, this seems like a reasonable proposal that shines a light on and increases the transparency on the quality of these transactions. And beyond publicly noticing it and making these calls available to anybody who wants to participate, we have a limited ability to control the potential impact that this would have to third parties. I do see Jenny got back in the queue.
Hi, Danny. Hi, Danny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Jenny Mystery from Salt River Project. So on the previous slide, I just wanted to clarify, that CAISO won't be using the LPT export in the RSE to ensure, CAISO does not have additional burden to pass the RSE. In the same way, for WEIM entities who are receiving this export, CAISO is still allowing them to include it because of the concerns of, if we don't include it, then, we will have the burden of showing extra supply, which may not be efficient to pass the RSE. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the proposal, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. And then I would also like to comment on the LPT export tagging rules. I understand. I think CAISO is going in a correct direction, and I guess providing more transparency on the WEIM side that it will be tagged kind of conditional, kind of non-firm. But I have a question regarding if an export, if a transaction starts somewhere as a firm, on the northwest side, and then coming to CAISO, since we don't have any methodology right now, through the CAISO, billing through the CAISO BA, one end is a firm transaction, and then now CAISO, on the other end, where it goes out of CAISO as an LPT export, that would not be a fair, accounting of that transaction, because the BA might be relying on that on the other side to count it as firm. So I would like to, get some input or.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a loaded topic, Jenny. I think our position would be we have a framework in place that allows wheels to get high priority through the CAISO BAA. Right now, we are actively looking to revise that through a stakeholder process. But right now, absent a BAA meeting that criteria, the transaction from the ISO would come out as an LPT export.
Okay, all right. Thank you for clarification.
Sure.
All right, no other callers in queue.
Okay. I think we can advance a couple slides then to the last topic. Yes, so this is the second major topic that we're looking to address in this proposal, and it stems from that desire to try to leverage the WEIM to increase reliability in stress system conditions. In the previous iteration, we put forward a proposal for something we're calling assistance energy transfers. These would be transfers that can occur in the WEIM following the failure of the WEIM RSE. We would look for them to be able to cure undersupply or deficient supply conditions in a balancing authority area participating in the WEIM through allowing these transfers at a hurdle rate. We think that this is beneficial, and we've heard a lot of parties think this is beneficial simply because the CAISO's optimal dispatch may be able to uncover additional supply that can be used to cure insufficiencies during stress system conditions as compared to the more traditional get on the phone, call your neighboring BAAs, hope that they have transmission, hope that they have residual supply. This is an optimal dispatch base that respects market constraints. So we think that this does represent an improvement in that area. One of the concerns we've heard in this process is a lot of BAs want to make sure that these types of transactions don't propagate reliability concerns. We would look to leverage an existing constraint that we have in the WEIM right now that does not let any WEIM export transfers occur if a PBC constraint relaxation is present in the source balancing authority area. So any balancing authority area who is supplying these types of transactions would not be supplying them and moving themselves into a capacity deficiency. Under marginal cost pricing principles, we would look to settle all of the real-time imbalance load at the resultant LMPs for these transactions. We have an example of why this makes sense a couple slides from now, but the principle here is if a BAA is short and needs to meet its load and the transactions are priced at this hurdle rate, then that is the marginal resource in ensuring that BAA is able to meet its demand. On this last bullet, want to clarify, we would look for this to be optional functionality. This was an idea that NVE kind of put forward in the workshops we had in the spring, which we think makes a lot of sense. This would be at each BAA's discretion. We would look for this to be a master file configurable flag, so a BAA would have the ability to choose to utilize this or not. That choice would be made within the master file update horizon, which I think is in the 5 to 7 day range. We did hear some desire for balancing authority areas to have more granular optionality on this functionality, potentially the ability to toggle this functionality on an hourly basis. This to us doesn't make a lot of sense, and we think is actually inconsistent with the principle of trying to increase reliability through the WEIM. Either a balancing authority area doesn't want to increase their reliability through the WEIM, or does want to increase their reliability through the WEIM. Allowing them the control through master file would allow them at least to decide, like, do they want to have this functionality during normal conditions or stress system conditions? But again, when a balancing authority area is in stress conditions, if they want to increase their reliability through the WEIM, great. We think we're providing that functionality, but we don't think that this should ultimately become an economic choice where they're trying to balance against what they're able to get bilaterally through emergency energy assistance or through the WEIM. Either a BA wants to engage in this functionality or not. Can we go to the next slide? So stakeholders have previously offered pretty broad support for this concept. The main feedback we got in the previous iteration of this proposal was actually just a lot of additional questions on how we would propose to implement this, what are the impacts to price formation, how would this be settled. We believe that in the draft final proposal, we have answered a lot of those questions. We have a much more detailed framework for how we would propose to implement this. We've included examples showing how this would be priced. So we think we've met this objective, and I think next slide we're going to start walking through how we would propose to do this. Some stakeholders, and this was a sizable portion of the commenters, did raise concerns about this functionality being abused as a tool to avoid sufficient forward procurement. That's something that we recognize and we do agree with. What we didn't see in the comments, however, was a consensus position on what the administrative consequences would be to prevent that. It is something that is really hard to right size. You could have abuse by a BAA routinely doing this for a couple megawatts. It could be abuse for a BAA being woefully short for a single interval. Absent any consensus of how we would try to prevent this misuse, our proposal at this point is to monitor to determine if misuse of this functionality is occurring. And then once there's evidence of misuse and those patterns of misuse have been identified, if necessary, we would look to try to design a more targeted and potentially appropriate mitigative measure to prevent misuse. The last bullet I have here regards our proposal to cure oversupply conditions. In the straw proposal, we put out an idea of if a BAA failed the flex ramp down test and was in an oversupply condition, at some point we would actually relax the export transfer constraint, allowing them to export a portion of their oversupply. We thought this would be beneficial because the BAA in an oversupply condition wouldn't be exposed to as low of negative prices, while the rest of the EDAM footprint would benefit from low-cost supply. Additionally, the entire area benefits by not having to curtail what is likely very low-cost or negative-priced renewable resources. We think this idea still has a lot of merit, but in trying to work through the implementation for spring of 2023, we think that this is an item that we will need to defer for future policy development. When you start getting into how this would actually work and how do you have a negative price transfer cost with negative prices, it basically adds an order of magnitude of complexity to negative pricing, which is already something that on its surface may not make a lot of sense to all participants. So again, this is a good idea. I think that we will pursue it at a future time, but we want to make sure we give it the appropriate amount of time to have policy development that all parties understand, and that we're ensuring we're still creating the right incentives for downward flexibility, and as such would defer this to a future initiative. I see a question from Robert. So Robert, do you want to go ahead and ask your question when your phone line's open?
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Dan?
Yeah, it's still a little bit
okay.
wonky, but I'll try.
I apologize. I'm in a different setup today. So I really appreciate these proposals. I think it's wonderful. I would like to just emphasize, in addition to the master file flag, I feel it would be nice to have some kind of real-time additional flag to opt into this aspect, because there could be situations where infeasibilities could occur in the market for an EIM entity that are not really representative of an emergency type situation where we may need the additional energy. It could be, a fat finger on a bias. It could be any type of those situations. And so I just want to state again, I feel like it would be nice to have an additional real-time flag in addition to that. So just because, we're going to be monitoring for these types of situations. And if we're monitoring and we come back and go, well, yeah, that was an accident, they made this mistake, or we shouldn't have failed, or it wasn't this type of emergency situation, I feel like a real-time flag would be an additional supportive aspect because of the possible iterations we may go through in that monitoring aspect.
Yeah, thank you for your comment, Robert. That's, I think, a different take on this idea that we've kicked around a little bit internally would be potentially having maybe some type of marginal energy price cutoff that indexes the transfer costs that we're applying to these assistance energy transfers, so that maybe if the marginal energy cost of the system is $70, it's not the transfer cost that's proposed in this proposal, which really we think is more targeted to stress emergency system conditions. I think that's something that going forward we would definitely be open to exploring, either that or maybe some more optionality. I think that's a better way than just the toggle on and off, because then it allows entities to decide if they want this functionality, yes or no, for reliability, but it also would reduce exposure kind of to high charges during non-peak system conditions. But I hate to keep going back to this. If we are trying to implement something by June 1 of 2023, I think according to our internal development schedules, we would have actually probably already sent all this stuff over to get built already. So this is already a really, really heavy lift and tall task for our technology team. So good idea. We're open to it. It might be in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the additional thoughts. I still, from an IT perspective, I feel like a simple flag would be just as implementable and simple to do. But I do complexity of it and the additional discussion on it.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I see another caller in the queue.
Yes, so moving to Jenny. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Jenny Mitri from SRP. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Jenny.
Yeah. So first, I do want to, support what Robert said. I think we were thinking in the similar terms, sometimes during non-stress condition also, we kind of fail because of other reasons, and we don't want to have that financial burden, just because we signed up in the master file. But I also wanted to comment on, you just something said, Danny, that, this may be applicable kind of in a stress system condition. That's how CAISO thought about it. But did we, maybe I don't remember, but did we define specifically what is the stress system condition that, this would be applied for in the proposal somewhere?
Okay. So I think to answer both of your points, Jenny, Regarding the stressed or unstressed system conditions and not wanting exposure to the pricing that results from this, we think that through the master file that exists in the master file it's under a week for updating. So if SRP in the springtime doesn't want to expose themselves to this, then they could opt out, and then when they move into more stressed conditions with a little bit of lead time would have the ability to revise their decision to incur this functionality. That would be a mechanism to lower their risk on this. On your second, what was the second part of the question?
I was just asking if we globally define what is the stress condition in the market.
Okay, yeah. So what I was getting at was more thinking where this could go in the future. As part of this proposal, we are not looking to define stressed or not stressed system conditions. That is a more complicated task that I think the System Market Power Initiative has tried to do. We tried to do a little bit in EDAM. It's something that will take quite a bit more time and work with stakeholders than we think that we have to try to get something implemented by summer 2023. So this would be applied during all conditions, stressed or non-stressed. We would provide balancing authority areas optionality to control their exposure during stressed and non-stressed conditions through that master file flag.
Okay, thank you. I think clarifying or removing that stress word or clarifying the way you just said would be helpful in the proposal. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
There are no additional questions in queue.
Okay, so moving on to how this would actually work. We would look to have assistance energy transfers occur when two conditions are met. First, a BAA would have to opt in to this program. They would then need to fail the WEIM RSC's capacity or flexible ramping sufficiency upward test. Following this, we would model the assistance energy transfers in the market at a hurdle rate, basically a transfer cost of $1,000 or $2,000, depending upon the applicable bid cap. This would be an incremental transfer cost into the deficient balancing authority area. Right now, we have existing functionality where we have really de minimis transfer costs that we apply in the WEIM. This ensures that we are able to optimally clear a solution and are reliably clearing transfers and they're not moving all over the place. We, in our goal to try to have something implementable, are leveraging this functionality and would look to model the transfer costs at, again, $1,000 or $2,000. This then allows the cost to be reflected in the congestion component of the LMP in the deficient balancing authority area. To do this, we will need a lot of coordination on the penalty prices that the CAISO has. Some of the feedback we've heard is a desire to ensure that all resources internal to the deficient BAA have been dispatched. All available balancing capacity internal to the deficient BAA has been utilized. To do this, we again need to revise the penalty prices within the scheduling run to ensure that all of that capacity is utilized for energy prior to clearing these types of transfers. As an additional knock-on effect of this does require changing the power balance constraint penalty price when assistance energy is elected. Essentially, the power balance penalty price needs to be indexed upwards to ensure that this right sequencing occurs. So in normal conditions, the power balance relaxation price would actually go to $2,000. In when we have cost verified bids above $1,000, it would go to $4,000. The reason you need to do this, I think, becomes apparent on the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? So this is an example that we lifted directly out of the paper. What you see here is Balancing Authority Area 1 has a real-time energy imbalance requirement of 500 megawatts. They have 400 megawatts of supply internal to their balancing authority area. It's priced in this example at $950. They obviously would fail the WEIM RSC. They're 100 megawatts supply deficient. Now, for the purposes of this example and keeping it simple, please ignore any internal congestion in the formulation of the LMP and BAA1. But the way we envision this working is BAA1 has elected to receive assistance energy transfers. They would then receive 100 megawatts of assistance energy transfers with a $1,000 incremental transfer cost. This results in the LMP in the deficient BAA1 being set at $1,175. This reflects the $1,000 price for this transfer cost, as well as the $175 prevailing energy price in the remainder of the footprint. Now, why you would need to ensure that the power balance constraint relaxation penalty price is increased is that if it's still at 1,000, the market optimization would actually just choose to relax the PBC in deficient BAA rather than clearing these assistance energy transfers. If you take the most extreme example, and it's at $999 in the external footprint, you would actually need the PBC price to be at $2,000 to ensure that you're clearing additional transfers into the deficient BAA prior to relaxing the power balance constraint in the deficient BAA. I do want to note here that the LMPs in the remainder of the footprint aren't directly affected by these types of transfers. They are only affected to the extent that backing these transfers results in supply clearing higher up the bid stack in the remainder of the WEIM footprint than would otherwise occur if this 100 megawatt transfer did not occur into BAA1. I hope that kind of walks through how we envision this working. Are there any questions?
There are currently no questions in queue.
Oh, I see questions. I'm glad we waited.
All right, Jeff, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, Danny. It's Jeff with PowerX. I just didn't get to the button quickly enough. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. First of all, I just at a high level, you mentioned this at the very beginning of the call that I think there's been recognition kind of broadly that reliability is the #1 priority in the EIM, and I think we're very supportive of trying to find a framework that would allow for the EIM to provide assistance to entities that need it in a way that still is consistent with the objectives of resource sufficiency, but clearly cutting people off at the worst time is something we want to avoid. So I think this is the structure of this makes a lot of sense, but there's just a few areas I wanted to clarify. One was, and we talked about this on the last call, but I just wanted to ask it again because it still isn't totally clear to me in the way that the proposal is written, but my understanding is that the entity that elected this functionality and opted in for the assistance would, that 100 megawatts would be relative to either zero or their base scheduled transfer. Is that right? When you refer to energy assistance?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Actually, I probably should have spent more time on this. The other point with the way we tried to structure these prices is that all supply internal to the deficient BAA should have been utilized prior to needing to trigger this, right? Like all of their internal supply bid up to $1,000, or the ABC that they're holding should be utilized. So the remaining transfers into that deficient BAA, we think, do represent the actual quantity of supply that they need from the WEIM to cure their shortfall.
Yes, I agree with that, and I actually think that there's a related element to that, which is that I think it provides some protection to entities that feel like they failed inadvertently in a situation like that, because if they failed inadvertently and they do have internal resources to use, that's what will happen first. So they won't be, sort of automatically exposed to a penalty to the extent that there is really actually supply available they can use. So I think that's helpful as well. But the other area that I don't think's in the slides, but I noticed in the proposal, and I just wanted to ask about is, it sounded like you were suggesting that entities that opt in would have this framework that we're talking about, but entities that don't opt in would continue along with the existing approach, including having their transfers limited to their previous hours or previous interval, I should say's level. And I just wanted to ask about that because just first of all, maybe to make sure that that is what you were thinking, and then give you some feedback.
Yeah, that's what we were thinking. We're still a little bit wary of reducing transfers all the way to zero if they've occurred due to the real-time reliability concerns. So it would either be existing rules or this new functionality.
Okay, I think we have some concern with that element of it. I mean, first of all, the idea that this is an option, I think, is a good one, because you can basically let the EIM entities decide whether or not they feel as though they want to enable the ability to receive this type of supply when it's available and face the hurdle rate. And other entities may say, I don't feel the need to do that. I'd rather just avoid facing a potential hurdle rate under any circumstance, and I'm comfortable with that. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But as we've talked about in the past, one of the challenges with the existing framework is the capping at the previous import is not really an equitable, or in our view, an equitable or appropriate consequence, because on a couple fronts. Number one is it effectively assesses a different level of repercussions to an entity based on what they were doing in the market in the previous interval. If somebody was an exporter in the previous interval and then they fail, they're effectively shut out of the EIM altogether because they'd be capped at zero from an import point of view. Whereas if a different entity has already started importing, then they can continue to do that even if they don't really have enough supply to meet their own load, and they're using the market to fill that shortfall. So I think we should reconsider that and really think through this element of it, because if you give the choice to the entities, I think what makes more sense is to say the starting point is, if you don't have enough supply to meet your own load, particularly with respect to the capacity test, where you're just measuring, do you have enough resources to meet your own load, and you fail the capacity test, the starting point is that your transfers are at zero and you face that hurdle rate if you elect to. And the reason I say that is it levels the playing field. Everyone has the same element of the same repercussions as far as failing, and it's clear what those are. But also because, as you were pointing out, if you fail the test and you don't have enough supply, then to the extent you're receiving EIM energy to support that, that is filling a shortfall through the market and effectively leaning on the market. And so I think you're providing a framework here to say, if you want to do that and use the market to fill that gap, then you should opt into this approach. And what will happen is you will deplete your own resources first. If you still need more to fill in the gap, then you will face the hurdle rate to receive those transfers. So I kind of feel as though it solves the reliability concern by making it a financial consideration, and it lets the EIM entities decide, each of them, whether or not they would like to participate in that potential assistance or not. But at the same time, it addresses the problem with the current approach that we don't think is effective in terms of the way that it applies that limit depending on what you were doing in the previous interval. And so I was just wondering, can you speak to that, or is that something that we can consider or that you would be willing to consider?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Jeff. My initial reaction is it's a little bit hard to think that we're going to reduce potential reliability for BAs, but I do understand on the other hand that we are offering an avenue to kind of ensure reliability. So I think this would be something that we would look to explicitly ask in the comment template and receive feedback about where the broader stakeholder community would be on this item.
Yes, I think that makes sense. I just wanted to put it out there because, like I say, I think this is conceptually, I think this makes sense. The hurdle rate concept, for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, makes sense. But this was also the opportunity I think we wanted to take as far as phase 2 goes to reevaluate the consequences and try to make sure that they're sending the right incentives and that they're consistently applied across all the different entities in the EIM. And so I do think that this detail is an important one towards that overall objective.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that observation and comment.
All right, Bonnie, you may go ahead.
Representative. I'm not sure.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Bonnie.
Is that better, Danny?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer. Thank you.
Okay, good. With respect to the change to the power balancing constraint relaxation figure from 1,000 to 2,000, I'm not sure I understand the implications of that. So first off, does the energy bid cap remain at 1,000 unless you have a cost justified bid higher than that?
Yes, it should.
Okay. And likewise, the hurdle rate would stay at 1,000, right?
Yes, if you have a $1,000 bid cap, the hurdle rate would stay at 1,000, but then the relaxation penalty price would go up to 2,000.
Okay. And so would that mean that, I guess it sounds like it would mean that the LMPs, and I'm putting aside the cost justified bid above 1,000. I'm at the moment focused on the sort of the $1,000 energy bid cap under most circumstances. So LMPs could end up being between 1,000 and 2,000 if the energy bid cap is at 1,000, and then they could end up being between 2,000 and 4,000 if the energy bid cap goes up to 2,000 because of a cost justified bid greater than 1,000. Am I following that right?
Yeah, with the small caveat, it's a little bit predicated at the prevailing marginal price outside of the failed BA, but as long as it's positive, yeah, in your example, if you have the bid cap at 1,000, you would expect the LMPs to be somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 because you have that $1,000 transfer cost placed on the transfer.
Okay, all right. I'm visualizing it correctly. Thanks very much.
Sure.
All right, there are no additional.
Nope, I see one more. Let's go back.
Dan, go ahead.
Hey, Dan from CES again. Just forgetting even what to call it. It's been a really long week for all of us here.
Great.
The limitation for the power balance constraint pricing within the EIMBAs, I'm just forgetting what it's called, when they're within their tolerance bandwidth, keeps them from going to 2,000, maybe at a lower price. Am I ringing any bells there?
Not off the cuff. Maybe Brad or George, is that ringing bells?
Yeah, that's the. I'm also forgetting what we called it. But when you're saying when when we have cost verified bids above 1,000 and we raise the power balance constraint to 2,000, if the power balance relaxation is within a certain number of megawatts, we set the price at the price of the highest price cleared bid rather than at the power balance constraint price.
Exactly.
Right.
Thanks, Brad. Does that have any bearing whatsoever on any of the pricing that we're talking about here, or is it more straightforward in this situation?
I think that would. Go on, Brad.
So I think it would. So like, I think it would still apply. Just my off the cuff answer. So we reserve the price to change this, but change my answer. But so say this BAA1's threshold is 50 megawatts, and so if the energy assistance transfers weren't enough to resolve its shortfall, so say it got the 100 megawatts and the price went to 1,175, and then there isn't any more than 100, but then it just needed 110 megawatts to resolve. Then after the 100, the market relaxes its power balance constraint by 10 megawatts. Then that price would stay at the 1,175, I think, and only go to 2,000 if it was more than, what did I say, 50? I think it still kicks in, but we need to think about that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, it just sprang to mind when seeing this, and sorry to make you think about it on the fly, but maybe that's something to look at offline.
We were thinking about, we thought about ABC, available balancing capacity, but I don't remember we discussed that, so we need to think about that internally. I think it works the way I told you, though.
Okay. And just to kind of clarify my comment previously on the tagging aspect, I guess from where I'm coming from is that, transparency is good, and there probably is a need to look at how, LPT exports that clear RUC or HAS should be treated by, receiving BAs, and what tags communicate in that context. I guess I'm just saying that the impact of establishing new tagging expectations for those transactions feels like it extends beyond being just a EIM RSE counting issue, and that decision to use it, to either have them tagged as firm provisional or something else is a meaningful one for the market. So, doing that versus doing firm or non-firm is a decision that might need more thought and consideration than thinking about it just in the context of EIM resource efficiency counting. So it's been a long week trying to think through this stuff clearly, but that was what I was trying to get across.
Okay, thank you, Dan. All right, we can move to the next slide. So the natural question that arises is, what do we do with this additional revenue that would be generated by assistance energy transfers? First, I want to point out that this revenue would be collected from metered demand as the proposed formulation embeds this cost within the LNP, within the efficient balancing authority areas. That's where the revenue would come from. Our settlement systems would break out and be able to identify this assistance energy transfer revenue separate from traditional congestion revenue. So we would know the quantity of revenue that's derived from this specific action. The proposal is then to allocate this revenue to net EIM exporting BAAs pro rata based off their exporting quantity. We do think that this creates incentive for WEIM balancing authority areas to make additional supply bid and at cost available in the WEIM, specifically in tight supply conditions, because to the extent that you are more of an exporting BAA, you could potentially derive greater assistance energy revenues. We did put a couple different options out in the straw proposal. I think the other option was to utilize the residual capacity that could be seen when we run the RSE. That does have some merits and did have some support from stakeholders. Ultimately, we think that the proposal to allocate it to net EIM exporters is reasonable, but also going back to what we can implement, we already are making this net exporting calculation within our existing systems. So from an implementation perspective, we wouldn't have to make any additional changes. We wouldn't need to have any additional integration between our systems, between market and the settlement systems to facilitate the other potential allocation. So ultimately, we are proposing to allocate it as kind of described in the title slide here. Are there any questions on the proposed allocation? I have James on the call, and James really likes talking about settlements, so let us know. Okay. Not hearing any additional questions. I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today. There is a bit of a tight turnaround on the comment period. Again, we're going to ask for forgiveness later because we think that this is necessary to be able to get your comments in and have time to really understand them and let them inform the final proposal that we're looking to put out in a few weeks' time from now. Again, all of this is just in the effort to be responsive and have something in place by summer 2023. So thank you in advance for the extra work that the short turnaround on comments will necessitate. So I'd like to turn it back over to Isabella, and thank you again, everybody, today for your robust participation.
Thanks, Danny. So as far as next steps, the EIM decisional classification for this initiative is, we're proposing joint authority for all elements of the proposal, with the exception of the changes to the lower priority export tagging rules. And this is because the proposed LPT tagging would change the rules about how to tag exports from the CAISO BAA and are not applicable to the WEIM participants in their capacity as WEIM participants. And then the ISO views the proposed changes to the tagging rules as severable from the remainder for the remainder of the proposal. So the proposed schedule, again, we'll be taking comments on September 12th. We'll be getting the comment template up today for you all. And then we also did post the draft tariff language this morning. We will be holding a stakeholder call on the 15th to walk through the tariff language, and then we will accept comments on the 27th. And so the notice for that meeting was posted this morning. And then right now we're targeting September 26th to post the final proposal, and then a October 26, 2022 joint governance meeting board date. And then again, the June 1st, 2023 implementation. So this slide here just gives you a link to the WEIM RSCE Phase 2 initiative webpage. And then again, the deadline is September 12th, and we will have a template up for you today so you can start working on comments. And that template will be linked on the initiative webpage. And then my last reminders, I'd just like to again remind everyone that registration for the 2022 Stakeholder Symposium is open. We'll be holding it at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th this year. And then also, we do have sponsorship opportunities available. So if you are interested, you can learn more by going to the ISO's website. You'll want to click on that Stay Informed tab, go to Stakeholder Symposium, and then we have some information about sponsors and sponsorships on that page. So I'll pause here to see if there are any other questions before we conclude.
There are currently no questions in queue.
All right, not seeing any. Then that concludes today's call. Thank you all for your participation and have a great weekend.